Now, if you are in Nigeria or know people in this country, you can't have missed all the reactions that have continued to trail the central bank's cash swap policy. The latest has come from the Council of State, which is a top-level body that advises the president. The council rose from a meeting today saying that it supports the redesigned policy, but that if enough of the new money is not available, then the old notes should be recirculated as a stopgap measure. President Buhari is due to decide imminently what to do about all this. Meanwhile, even as millions have been thrown into hardship, some economists have described the currency redesign initiative as a success which has brought trillions of naira into the banking system and will likely help in the fight against inflation, vote buying and corruption. So what happens next? Well, for his take on this, I'm joined now on the line from Lagos by Nigeria's former Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, Dr. Kalu Kalu. Dr. Kalu, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Are you one of those heaving a sigh of relief at the Supreme Court's decision to suspend this cash swap deadline?
Yes, Charles, thank you very much. I think I should say a few things before we even get to the main question. This our eagerness to applaud ourselves that our policies are so right, but it's just our implementation that's the problem. I think that just usually understates the severity of the mistakes that we have made over and over again. Of course, other countries have their own problems, but I think we need to make a distinction between policies that are designed to meet specific situations that have been properly studied. There has to be empirical analysis in the issue of this currency, for instance. It is obvious that what we are dealing with is not new. What we are dealing with, others have dealt with, even we have dealt with in the past. So the clear question is how we were able to identify, first, what currencies we needed to change, how much of which we had to print, and even more so, how to distribute in a seamless manner so we will not fall into the problem that we now find ourselves. So the issue of applauding the policy or not should not really arise. I mean, that is not the question. Everybody accepts that this is done by just about every country for all kinds of reasons. No stir-up, regardless of the quality of the paper. They get counterfeited to all kinds of measures depending on the intricacy of the designs and so on and so forth. So this is something that should be normally routine. So we don't need to be slapping ourselves on the back as if we made a success of it. That is not the question. The question that really needs to be answered, and I think the CBN is fully equipped to answer this. And by the way, this is not an issue about the statutory responsibilities or the independence of the CBN. Everybody has accepted the independence of the CBN. But that independence presupposes a clear understanding of how monetary and fiduciary policies are put together, taking cognizance of the various stages that the economy will be going through. I've listened to a lot of commentators talk about the fact that we have so many areas that are unbanked. It's a vast country. And by the way, let me just correct one thing. You know, I was twice, had a two-time stint in Ministry of Finance, but I was also National Planning Minister and Transport Minister. Now, this kind of question brings together all the macro issues that one has had to deal with during my tenure as a Minister of the Federal Republic. The vast expanse of this country, the number of villages and towns, the sheer number of people who are still outside the banking sector, despite all the effort that we have made in the past to create all kinds of units, small rural farms, People's Bank, microfinance banks. These were all institutions that were created over several years, I could say over the last 4 decades, to make sure that we do not have the kind of unbanked population that we have now. Nevertheless, by the time you prepare a policy to print the notes, I believe this is a purely technical issue. And of course, the central bank has the full responsibility for this, working with the Mint, now that we print locally. Before we printed abroad, but we now print it locally. I have no idea what percentage we print abroad, if any. But we are dealing really with the question of logistics. That is the primary thing. And that is the question. I know that we don't need to go into all the technical details, but at least that should be the starting point of the analysis, not whether the policy is successful or not. There's nothing to talk about success or failure yet. It took quite a while before numbers started coming out as to indicate just how much was withdrawn from circulation. We've got numbers of 3 trillion. And the only number I recall I have seen in the papers is 300 billion. So that's a shortfall of 1.7 billion. Well, it is the central bank that can put pay to the gap between what is printed and what has been circulated. Even what has been circulated, we know that there are so many relatively small users, artisans, small businessmen, market women, rural dwellers, farmers, and so on and so forth. So the people who distribute, the central bank officials, the departments that are in charge of distribution, have to be armed with some kind of a model of the distributive network. That's why I talked about the transportation that's involved. How do you deliver this seamlessly to different locations miles away from the production point, wherever that is? So we are dealing with matter of logistics. Not really, as the question seems to have come up, a question of jurisdiction and independence. That independence means you should be able to understand the structure of the economy,
right? Well,
the distribution of the population, and so on.
Right.
Yes.
Well, you've made...
that's really the issue that we should be focused on.
Right. You've made a lot of points there, and I would agree with a lot of them, but I also have to say that there are a number of issues that obviously arise as a result of this policy. But you made a point about the shortfall between the amount of money that's been mopped up and the amount of money that's been reintroduced. I mean, if part of the reason that the central bank is doing this is to reduce the amount of money that is floating around outside the system, do you think it should reintroduce that same amount back into the system?
Obviously not. But we are so far from that, Charles. It's an empirical question, which perhaps only the experts within the central bank and the financial experts within our financial system can answer. Now, what proportion? This should have been decided a priori, obviously. What proportion do you introduce to make sure that you do not have, as we say, too much money chasing too few goods? We should have decided that. And then the pattern of distribution is also very important, clearly. So I believe that we are not even close, from what I have seen, to what should be construed as adequate to fight inflation. And by the way, let me also emphasize the fact that it must be a concern of the central bank, like it is to every other Nigerian, that we have so much money outside the system. And we should know from practice and from every evidence from other countries that people are encouraged, holders of currency, are encouraged with all kinds of financial instruments, with all kinds of rates of interest on their deposits, aside the question of providing easily available sources for making their savings. So we cannot be wondering, we cannot pretend that our people prefer to keep the money outside the system. We also need to look at the instrumentalities that have been put in place. We've always been regarded as one of the countries that have very low savings, because when we measure these savings, we look at precisely what is within the monetary system. Whereas we are supposed to be looking at the entire money supply, how much is in circulation, how much is held idly in other locations. it is the responsibility of the financial institutions, the central bank, working, of course, with the Ministry of Finance and the banks, to create a web of incentives that will encourage the flow of these funds into the financial system. There is no magic to it. It's not as if Nigerians prefer to keep their money out more than other people. But you find that in the course of development, you have to develop these instruments that will continue to encourage farmers, traders, people coming from their farms. They don't have to carry the farm gate sales right to their homes. They can even stop in at credit unions, farmers' unions, all kinds of institutions that are readily available and are precisely targeted to mobilize these resources. So while we are focusing on this issue, we should also remember that we have not quite succeeded. Despite the fast growth of the economy, we are an economy that has grown on staples, palm fruits, palm kernels, cocoa, cotton, soybeans, and the rest of it. We should have had matching institutions that help to mobilize these funds, so they are not just kept in pots and pans and other mattresses. So that is another issue that should really be taking center stage in all this discussion. Not this notion of trying to, as it were, blame the Malams for selling foreign exchange, blame.
Right, we understand. I understand the points you're making, but I mean, you are a man of enormous experience. I mean, apart from the fact that you've been a minister of the Federal Republic several times, you've also been sitting in sort of cabinet meetings at the highest level, so you understand both the economy, finance, and the politics of all of this. Is this move, in your assessment, a matter of federal government political policy and less an issue of financial or monetary policy within which the CBN has independent powers on such sort of matters? Because the ostensible reason, or at least one of them, for this policy is to stop the politicians from vote buying. So it's a policy matter that's being driven at least partly by politics rather than monetary policy. Is that how you see it?
I'm afraid, Charles, I see it a little bit differently. I understand this emphasis, but you look at how this appears to any onlooker, our citizens and others. Surely, if people want to buy votes, we should have restraining laws. We should have our whole intelligence, we should have our police institutions to monitor these things, particularly at this point in time. I will not agree that the first point of call should be where you change the currency as it were to ambush those who suspect have accumulated funds to buy votes. Why not go directly to them? Why tamper with the whole supply chain down to the farms and to the factories? And just about every aspect of the industrial matrix you tamper with when you interfere with the flow of funds. Now, looking at the insignificant portion of those who could be construed as being involved in vote buying, there must be more direct ways of checking it and not assume that it is only to sweep the currency off their feet, as it were, as the most efficient way to do this. So I accept. I ran for president at the time myself, I knew several years ago, but of course I never thought in terms of these things where you're accumulating funds to buy votes. And I think after 62 years, it still is quite preposterous for us to consider this as a way to stop people from buying votes, to make sure that they don't have the cash. Go after these people. What percentage of the politicians are there? What, even, is such an insignificant number it has to be. So what is our intelligence doing? What is our police? What even INEC has ways of making sure that they can trap those who are doing this, of course, aided by the police and intelligence. So I accept that this is a major factor. But I think we have jumped too quickly to the sense that this is one way we can do it efficiently. I don't believe that is the case.
So again, tapping into your vast experience, Dr. Kalu, I mean, what lessons might there be in all this for a new government coming in 2023? I mean, what does it tell us about the way this economy works and also the way the politics works and what should be corrected?
Well, I think every Nigerian has a right to expect so much from the incoming government. We've made all the possible mistakes we could have made. We can see where we are in terms of, well, a major economy. We are still the #1 economy. I haven't seen the latest adjusted GDP to know whether we are still #1, but I suspect we are still very much #1. But when you now break down the GDP in terms of sources of industrial production, at that level, we still look very somewhat primitive for the position that we have. So developments in industry, in all parts of industry, development in agriculture, we are not talking about just peasant farming and peasant production, but the whole chain of production, refining, processing, exports. We were a major exporter of staples 40, 50 years ago. And we should be a major power. Well, you saw the latest projection a few years ago, how we should be #9 in GDP and #3 in population. That presupposes a lot of structural transformation of the Nigerian economy. This is a big task for the incoming government. And I think that listening to some of the campaigns, the major players are very much aware that so much is expected. Unemployment, full employment rather than heavy underemployment, creating you know, a lot of wealth in agriculture, in industry, in the services sector, including even the arts and the performing arts and the music and so on and so forth. All of these sectors are so important. So we expect leaders who can truly mobilize Nigerians. And I think Nigerians are showing a lot of enthusiasm to embrace that kind of structural change. We're expecting a good attention on listening to what Nigerians are talking about, restructuring the polity. Now, that is so important. If Nigerians think that the structure should be restructured, the economy should be restructured, the politics should be restructured, the governance should be restructured, I think it is right for the incoming leader to pay attention. I would consider that one of the first things that should be considered. How do you select Nigerians? What institutions should do this? Should it be the National Assembly? Should it be a group of wise men who can now answer that question? How do we improve our structure? Of course, improving our structure means the whole institution of laws that govern this country. And out of this come our economic policies, our trade policies, policies on movement of goods and services up and down, the issue of states and zones being related politically and institutionally, all kinds of questions. So I think we have a very good opportunity to take a new start, in virtually all these areas. So economic policy, of course, happens to be one of them. So my last word on that is, of course, that this is the time to now enthrone excellence, and there is no evidence to suggest that that comes from one zone or one state or the north or the south. We can see excellence from every sector of this country. So should we re-embrace excellence, as it were the way we received it from the colonial master as they left us. We have deviated from this. We must be people who know what they are doing, who have the requisite experience, and in good time, this should be fairly distributed to all sections of the country. Okay. So I think I am very, very hopeful that whoever wins this knows that the work is cut out for them. And that's what Nigerians are expecting.
Right. And is there anyone you particularly want to win this election? Do you favor any of the candidates? Do you see these things that you're talking about in any of them in terms of their character or their manifestos or their track record?
Well, Charles, I've heard you ask these questions, and you don't expect to trap me into that. I happen to know them. In fact, there are people I'm very, very familiar with. So I'm on a different platform when you talk about this. And I know that whoever wins, those of us who want to see Nigeria move forward in all the ways I've stated, We are going to make sure that we stay by them and push them, talk to them, encourage them, and work with them to make sure that they realize the hopes that Nigerians have every right to hope for.
Okay, well, that's
what I would say here. Of course, from the standpoint of equity and fairness, well, I agree that at these early seminal stages of independence, you want to make sure that every section of the country feels that they are as good and as represented as any other section. Those are the other things that will come into play. But we think Nigerian voters have heard it all, and I will trust that they are going to make their decision with all these issues in mind, to get a leader who can truly provide leadership, who can represent them, irrespective of where they come from, and who can listen to the yearnings of the lowest as well as the highest shareholders in this enterprise called Nigeria.
Well, I think you've worn your diplomatic hat very well there. But let's just return to more sort of comfortable, less uncomfortable sort of areas, which is, of course, the issue of finance and cash swap and so on. We're hearing that in the wake of all this, the Naira has been gaining against the dollar. I understand it's been exchanging at around 400 Naira to $1. Is that a distortion of reality brought about by the artificial pressure of this Naira scarcity, or is it something that you think is sustainable?
If I had to say one word, I said, obviously, the former is the case. You see, part of the problem we found ourselves, even when addressing the fact that so much money is outside the system, is the way we have ended up managing our exchange rates. You see, we debated issues 40 years ago, and over the years, we know that the Nigerian is a marketer, is a trader, he operates competitively. This is what you should be bringing to bear to make sure we do not create a multiple exchange rate system by all kinds of indicative allocations that are, from the outside, it looks very selective and not really based on any empirical issues. I know that prioritization in terms of sectoral investment you can encourage through all kinds of incentives, but we should make sure that going forward, we allow the Naira to reflect the competitive push by millions of suppliers and demand of foreign exchange. When we don't have that, we can't be talking in terms of appreciation. I saw some figure talks about 460 or something of the sort. Lately, we were looking at all kinds of spreads, even within the cob market, within the private market or the so-called black market. Now, regardless of where the demand is coming from, the unit, 1 unit exchange rate is the sum total of the weighted average of all the multiple rates in the economy. So that should be one of the targets of the central bank going forward, that we should make every effort to unify the exchange rate. That is what gives the incentive for investment and saving and production, exports, and so on and so forth. So I don't even think twice to tell you that that kind of report is just so presumptuous. It's certainly not true.
Right. Okay. Well, we've just got a couple of minutes or so left, and it's been a real pleasure talking with you. But just on that Naira swap issue, the buck is now with President Buhari. Elections are 2 weeks away. What would you advise him to do?
Well, a few weeks ago, I actually had this written down somewhere. My impression is that the proper logistics were not looked at. To the extent that that is true, we are talking about what you have to do in the immediate term. It is heart-rending to see the agonies, and it's gone beyond agonies. People are dying. I said this several weeks ago. Well, when I say so, I mean several days ago, definitely 2 weeks ago. People are dying. There's so much suffering. So you have to take steps in the immediate term. And there, what I will ask the president to do is to quickly get them to show him the figures on how much has been printed, how much of the old notes that were recovered can still be put back in circulation. Surely we must be able to have a system that can quickly put the two together. Deploy all your intelligence to follow those we suspect are going to be playing funny games for the elections. That's all we need to do. And I think that all the intelligence apparatchik we have in this country can handle it. So my suggestion is that we should ramp up the total supply that's available to those who need their naira. These are people who are asking for 20,000, 50,000, 100,000, at the most 500,000 maybe in terms of small-scale producers and so on and so forth. The big politicians probably have their own way of cornering what they need to spend in the units they need to spend, and I cannot swear that they have not done that. But maybe some of them are also really at a loss for very legitimate expenditures they have to go into 2 weeks to the election. So my advice to Mr. President is to make sure that supply will be ramped up very, very quickly. And of course, it should be easy for the experts to sit around and know how to marry these two, the old news plus those that are usable, the new notes plus those that are usable and still available in the denominations of 200, 500, and 1,000. I think maybe if they put that together, we'll be able to ease the unbelievable pain and suffering that is totally unwarranted and uncalled for and totally illegal in my mind. It is illegal to deprive somebody of their little savings on some grounds of somebody is buying votes by the bullion van load or whatever, truck loads or whatever. What has that got to do with the small Nigerian who just wants a little money to buy gari and make soup and feed his farmer and his family and just cater to medical needs and so on? The urgencies that people have suffered is unbelievable, and I think that this is a tragedy, what we've allowed to happen. So Mr. President has the onus to do something quickly. This is not a matter of weeks. This is a matter of days, if not even hours, to alleviate the suffering all over the country equally. We were told, for instance, that quite a lot was printed and flown to Katsina over a week ago. If they have to fly these funds to the capitals all over the country, there should be systems put in place. We have respectable bankers who can monitor this with their central bank overseers, and then the policy people can follow them, the police, the intelligence people, and all kinds of people, the local government staff and so on. All these people can be deployed to monitor this. And we should never, never have allowed this tragedy to occur.
And a final word from you about the independence of the central bank, because there's been a lot of focus on that recently. I mean, you were a former Minister of Finance, so you know more about these things than we do. Does the central bank only have independence that is limited by the policy matters which have to be determined by the president? So in effect, the central bank can't say in such matters that it is only that which it makes sort of determination about. In other words, is there a bit of a muddle when it comes to its independence with regard to policy matters and politics? And how should it be?
Well, you can say that in my previous background, before even coming back to Nigeria, I was a staff of the World Bank. We worked on several developing countries. We helped produce this policy about progressive independence of the central bank. The progression is correspondent to their ability to manage the economy. Can you imagine a situation where a few days ago, I even had the IMF make a comment about how we should loosen the deadline and so on. The IMF is never supposed to get involved with this sort of thing. The central bank autonomy presupposes that the central bank is fully aware of not just its responsibilities, but the wherewithal to implement its programs. And the onset of this, I must say, with all due respect to my friends in the central bank, they said they were independent and they had the statutory powers to deal with this. It was later on we started hearing about, oh, that the president approved this, the president approved that. So, well, where was the independence that was being flaunted? Indeed, the whole question of independence of central bank never featured. Nobody was doubting that this was their responsibility. Of course, in the course of development, as I said, in many countries, you can talk about independence. When I was Minister of Finance, both times, there was always a close liaison with the central bank governor. It worked for development, that they are working together, not flaunting independence in his own sake. So I think that we should be rest assured that that is not really the question. That question came up when we now realize that a lot of the logistics issues were never really properly looked into before this exercise was started. So I don't think the central bank should be worrying about its independence being stripped of it, but I think it should be concerned that this issue should not arise from looking back over their shoulders to see whether the homework was done before the exercise was already launched. And secondly, the issue is not whether they have statutory responsibility to extend by a week or 10 days. It is the time frame prior to this extension that they were supposed to be the people, the experts who will tell the government, we want to do this, this is how much time we require to do this. And that time frame will have been determined by a thorough empirical analysis of the structure of the economy, of the distribution of these currencies, with all the logistics, the transportation, and so on and so forth. So Charles, I don't think the issue of independence needed to have come up until we now realize that there was so much hitch in the process.
Dr. Kalu, I want to thank you very much indeed. We've been the beneficiaries of your great experience this evening. Dr. Kalu Idika Kalu is Nigeria's former Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, and also one-time Transport Minister. Thank you very much indeed.